Hogan had long played the role of superhero in the WWF's never-ending comic book. Like the Caped Crusaders of ink and film, Hogan had a penchant for saving the day, vanquishing the unwanted ills and protecting the collective from whatever evildoers may spring up. After a few months away, the Hulkster returned from sabbatical to try and fend off the latest nuisance to the WWF. Sagging business, which laid at the feet of the man playing the hero in his absence. The roster headed into the 1990 SummerSlam in Philadelphia was about as impressive a locker room as any promotion could ever boast. If you put a lot of stock in the WWE Hall of Fame, know that as of 2023, 14 of the 24 men that wrestled on this show have been inducted into that theoretical shrine. That's not even counting managers, color commentator Roddy Piper, non-wrestling performers like Ted DiBiase, Big Boss Man, and Sergeant Slaughter, nor does it include objectively worthy future inductees like Demolition, Earthquake, and Marty Jannetty. So yeah, a pretty stellar gathering all round. Now imagine if I were to tell you that of the 24 men that wrestled on the 1990 SummerSlam card, only 9 of them would be full-time active wrestlers in the WWF 2 years later. You'd probably think that some pretty major developments had to take place for that sort of wholesale change to occur, and you'd be right. But for now, it was business as usual within the land of Titan. The 1990 SummerSlam at the Philadelphia Spectrum hosted what could certainly be considered a quintessential WWF supercard, reinforcement of some top acts, and the ferrying up the card of fresh blood. The Texas Tornado, Kerry Von Erich, became Intercontinental Champion in the stead of grievously injured Brutus Beefcake. Tornado defeated Mr. Perfect in a very short, rather milquetoast match aided by a thunderous crowd response. The recently arrived Legion of Doom didn't have a match, but they played an important part in the tag team bout, exposing Demolition's unfair numbers game and causing them to lose to the Hart Foundation in a scintillating 2 out of 3 falls match. Other new acts were repaints of veteran talents. Hercules and Paul Roma came together through seemingly random circumstances, forming the team of Power and Glory. Together, they defeated the Rockers in a match where Jannetty had to go it alone, due to Shawn Michaels legitimately blowing out his knee weeks earlier. Power and Glory were managed by Slick, as was a now solo Warlord who squashed Tito Santana in a brief encounter. The Warlord's new look was a curious one. Half Phantom of the Opera, half metallic cyborg, played by a man who looked like Steve Austin after getting blasted by a gamma ray. Then there were some oddities, like Bad News Brown threatening to unleash an army of Harlem sewer rats as a counter to Jake Roberts' employment of pet python Damien. The rat angle never went anywhere, and Brown finished up with the WWF shortly after the SummerSlam match with Jake. Also departing was Sapphire, following an unusual angle that spanned 2 matches. Earlier in the night, Sapphire no-showed a singles contest with Sensational Sherry, thereby losing via forfeit. Later in the night, an understandably distracted Dusty Rhodes entered for his match with Randy Savage, only to be further distracted by the gravelly laugh of one Ted DiBiase. At the back of the arena, DiBiase revealed that he was the reason why Sapphire had no-showed, explaining that a bevy of expensive gifts that Sapphire had recently received from an unknown benefactor were in fact sent by him. The final humiliation was Sapphire proudly walking out in a full-length fur coat, proving once more that DiBiase could buy anyone on a whim. Sapphire was written off TV after the angle, right as DiBiase's new feud with Rhodes began. But in the so-termed double main event, the good guys prevailed. Hulk Hogan defeated the malevolent Earthquake via countout in what was nominally Hulk's comeback match. Based on the tone and tenor of Hogan's post-match promo, it was clear that the powers that be were getting Hogan ready for a third jaunt up the mountain. As for WWF champion The Ultimate Warrior, he did get to go on last, defeating Rick Rude inside the blue-barred steel cage, but the steam was dissipating. Warrior flopped as champion in Hogan's absence, as house show attendance fell and the star-audience connection was far less palpable. Re-welcoming Hogan only cast the shadow back over the Warrior and reminded fans who the real leading man was. The double main event drew an impressive 507,000 pay-per-view buys, not too far off WrestleMania 6's 560,000 buys. But one figures that was less for the new boss and more for the return of the old one. At least the WWF thought so. As the Empire prepared for an eventual re-changing of the guard, more changes dotted the landscape. SummerSlam was called by the oddball broadcast duo of Vince McMahon and Roddy Piper, who had just recently begun donning the headset on WWF superstars. That's because about a month before SummerSlam, following a 6-year run, Jesse Ventura quit the WWF. Things had grown contentious between Ventura and Vince due to the body refusing to sell his copyrighted likeness to McMahon, and because McMahon wouldn't let him use his name and likeness for a third-party wrestling video game that was ultimately never released. Due to these disputes, Ventura walked out. Ventura did end 1990 on a high note though, getting elected mayor of Brooklyn Park, Minnesota that November. It's not clear if fellow Minnesotan Rick Rude attended Ventura's inauguration, but he certainly would have had the time. That's because Rude quit the WWF in October after his own dispute. Out of action with a torn tricep, Rude's name was still being used in advertising for house show bouts with new rival The Big Boss Man, for which manager Bobby Heenan sometimes filled in as opponent. Rude contended that if the WWF was going to continue advertising his name in high billing for those events, he should get paid for all of those shows, since his name was being used to draw crowds. The WWF disagreed. Both sides argued, and the ravishing one quit over it. And talk about timing. Rude was one of 12 wrestlers featured in the WWF's first line of action figures produced by toy maker Hasbro, along with Hogan, Warrior, Savage, DiBiase, Bossman, Roberts, Beefcake, original Demolition members Axe and Smash, Akeem, and Andre the Giant. The figures proved popular for kids and collectors alike, though it is notable how outdated that first set quickly became. When Rude left, Akeem was already gone, Andre had faded out, and Axe would be leaving the following month. Add in Beefcake being in the midst of a long recovery process from his parasailing accident, and you're talking almost half of Series 1 being obsolete. Tonka's debut line of WWF wrestling buddies didn't have that problem, as their first set of stuffing-filled tackling dummies included Warrior, Hogan, Savage, and DiBiase, all active. Though the fact that both Warrior and Hogan were depicted wearing the WWF title may have indicated numbered days for the face-painted upstart. Amid all the turmoil, there was still fun to be had in the WWF. The October 13th Saturday night's main event broadcast was Oktoberfest themed, interspersing scenes from a star-studded Stein hoisting with bog-standard in-ring action. According to Bruce Pritchard, the lederhosen worn by the wrestlers cost $27,000 to replace, as they were ruined during the expected food fight sequence. On the upside, we did get to learn that Lanny Poffo was a master sausage stuffer, so there is that. In good times and bad, the WWF TV playbook still entertained millions, though one could certainly argue that applying Federation methodology to anything aside from wrestling was a recipe for disaster. Such was the case with McMahon's latest confounding project. In September of 1990, the World Bodybuilding Federation was formed. In true McMahon grandstand fashion, the WBF's formation was announced during the closing ceremonies of the IFBB's Mr. Olympia competition by former competitor Tom Platz, who McMahon had hired as WBF's talent director. The timing of the announcement was meant to jostle the bodybuilding industry, especially when Platz proclaimed that the WBF was going to kick the IFBB's ass. He boldly said this on the turf of IFBB founders Joe and Ben Weider, and battle lines were quickly drawn. A number of former IFBB talents filled out the initial roster of 13 competitors, including South Africa's Gary Strydom, whose name and likeness persist today as a meme among some in the wrestling community. But by mid-1992, the WBF was in ruins. Despite having the WWF machine aggressively behind it, not to mention celebrity rubs from Lou Ferrigno and Regis Philbin as an announcer, not a competitor, as well as a Saturday morning TV program called Body Stars, people just weren't interested in bodybuilding meets sports entertainment. The competitors were all given characters which true bodybuilding fans scoffed at, while wrestling fans already had their WWF fill with, well, the WWF. The WBF also bred resentment among the wrestlers, particularly when they found out that WBF competitors had something they didn't have: guaranteed contracts and reportedly medical benefits. Free crates of IcoPro weren't going to soothe any hard feelings either. Short for Integrated Conditioning Programs, IcoPro was a series of health supplements that many derided for their apparent awful taste. Even after the demise of the WBF, IcoPro branding and advertising persisted on WWF programming into the mid-90s, and the classic IcoPro banner made an appearance at Raw 25 in 2018. While Vince was looking to sign top bodybuilders for his new venture, wrestlers continued filing in and out of the WWF locker room. To offset the losses of Bad News, Demolition Axe, Akeem, The Honky Tonk Man, Red Rooster, and others, some new faces came into the fold, as well as old faces with new looks. After close to a year away, Jacques Rougeau returned to the WWF as the Mountie, an overbearing Canadian law enforcer armed with a debilitating cattle prod he used to shock the opposition. The gimmick was actually subject to litigation in Rougeau's native land, and for legal reasons, Jacques had to wrestle under his real name on WWF cards in Canada, minus some of the character's props. And he wasn't the only tag team star of yore going solo. Davey Boy Smith of the British Bulldogs had made his way back, redubbed the British Bulldog Singular. With beaded braids and ripped physique, the Bulldog more than looked the part of European superhero, costumed in vibrant Union Jack colours. Neither man needed their old partners, though the WWF's tag team division did get bolstered by a pair of wild hires. Brian Knobbs and Jerry Saggs of the Nasty Boys entered the WWF shortly after wowing fans and critics with their performances in WCW. The two were working without a contract when they were engaged in a particularly hard-hitting battle with the Steiner brothers at the 1990 Halloween Havoc, and Vince was all too happy to scoop up the scuzzy brawlers from Allentown, Pennsylvania. Far more understated was 21-year-old Dustin Rhodes, coming into the WWF as a supplement to his father's feud with DiBiase. Following some time on the house show circuit, Rhodes was introduced to the TV audience on Saturday night's main event as a fan watching his dad wrestle. When DiBiase tried to buy all of the front row seats for himself, proud Dustin refused to budge, ultimately resulting in DiBiase and Virgil leaving him bloody in a pretty underrated angle. And hey, a storyline indignity is certainly better than a character indignity. Journeyman Brady Boone debuted that autumn under a mask as Battle Cat, complete with little fuzzy ears on top of said mask. Boone didn't last long in the role, eventually replaced by enhancement talent Bob Bradley, before the cat was scratched altogether. All the comings and goings, of course, paled to one particular talent that debuted that fall, and while he did impress out of the gate, few could have forecasted exactly how his career would turn out. The weekend of the 1990 SummerSlam, Bruce Pritchard gave a certain young WCW mid-carder a ride to meet with Vince McMahon. Previously, McMahon had been less than impressed with what he saw out of the individual, noting that he looked like a tall, red-headed basketball player and didn't see much beyond that front page. But after meeting with the man in person, McMahon was much more affected, believing that this 25-year-old may have had a star quality after all. After getting the wrestler on board, Pritchard reportedly pitched a loose character premise in which he would portray the embodiment of evil, as a contrast to Pritchard's pseudo-saintly brother love character, as Pritchard wanted to manage him. When creative services drew mock-ups of what sort of outfit this evil character could wear, McMahon reportedly glanced at them and remarked, "Oh my god, he looks like an old-timey Undertaker." Mark William Calloway, professional alias Mean Mark Callis, would henceforth be known as The Undertaker. Actually, at one point he was named Kane the Undertaker, and even made several appearances with that short-lived handle. Pritchard takes credit for the Kane part, deriving it from Cain of Cain and Abel, the first person to ever commit murder. As for when The Undertaker would first step through the curtain before a large audience, the time would arrive on Thanksgiving night, and the Phenom wasn't going to be the only debutante at the ball. The 1990 Survivor Series emanated from the Hartford Civic Center on Thursday, November 22nd. After the event muscled its way onto Turkey Day 3 years earlier, the 1990 card ended up being the final one to run on Thanksgiving night. Though there's no way to be sure, one may assume that a certain holiday tie-in facilitated the divorce between the Federation and the day. For weeks leading up to Survivor Series, a giant egg was on display at the WWF's TV tapings. Fans were invited to speculate as to what would emerge from the egg when it finally hatched, and imaginations ran wild. A new megastar seemed to make the most sense, as you wouldn't hype this ginormous egg without some kind of major payoff. And the big moment came 5 matches deep into Survivor Series, with Mean Gene stationed by the aforementioned egg. After a little bit of setup patter, the egg started shaking and splitting. Okerlund bellowing that the egg was gonna blow was the verbal cue for something feathery to pop out. A man in an elaborate turkey costume stood amid the splayed shards of shell, first to silence, then to a chorus of boos. We quickly learned that this anthropomorphic bird was the gobbledygooker, who spoke only in, well, gobbles. Audible disappointment continued raining down as Okerlund and the Gooker, played by poor Hector Guerrero, the older brother of Eddie, carried on with the plan. And that plan was for Gooker to lead Mean Gene to the ring for a gymnastics exhibition, to the strains of Jim Johnston's cover of Turkey in the Straw. Guerrero was quite nimble and acrobatic, whereas Okerlund stumbled around in allegedly comical fashion. All the while, Monsoon and Piper on headset did everything they could to express glee while trying to drown out the crowd's vocal disinterest. The Gooker's dance-off with Mean Gene may have felt like eternal hell, but at least Survivor Series itself was pretty brisk by comparison. The streamlined elimination bouts were designed to lead to an ultimate survivors match, where all the surviving good guys and all the surviving bad guys would butt heads in a sort of bonus round. There were legendary moments for sure. Undertaker's debut as the mystery partner on Ted DiBiase's team resonated far greater than Guerrero's hammy hatching. From day one, Calloway had the character down to a T, and looked suitably frightening as he unflinchingly destroyed Dusty Rhodes and company. Undertaker may have been the bigger star coming out of the match, but Bret Hart shone brightly during its final stage against DiBiase, the tag star falling a hair short of outlasting the $1 Million Man. Hart's inspired performance came just one day after the death of his older brother Dean, and was yet another sign that a genuine singles push wasn't too far off. In another notable moment, the 1990 Survivor Series featured the first ever instance of an entire team surviving, as Rick Martel's Visionaries Quartet swept out Jake Roberts' Vipers contingent. For Roberts, who had worn an eye patch after being partially blinded by Martel's cologne atomizer, revenge would have to wait. At night's end, Hogan and Warrior were the final survivors, winning their earlier bouts before going on to outlast Martel's crew as well as DiBiase in a pretty pointless finale. At 400,000 buys, it was the most successful Survivor Series to that point. Warrior scored the final pinfall in each match that he won, but the writing was on the wall for his WWF title reign. The only question left was, would he be losing it to Hogan himself, or would a middleman be employed? If there was going to be a middleman, it wasn't going to be DiBiase. The $1 Million Man lost via disqualification to Warrior on a special Friday night edition of the main event on NBC, airing 24 hours after Survivor Series. Originally, the main event card was going to air on Saturday in its standard 90-minute late-night time slot. However, NBC was cooling on the WWF, and ratings had started to sag. To whatever degree the wrestling fad was fading, NBC was noticing it on their end. The network special being trimmed to an hour-long primetime airing actually benefited the WWF in this instance, as it allowed the company to scrap a pretty infamous match. On that main event taping in late October, the Rockers defeated the Hart Foundation in a 2 out of 3 falls match to become the WWF Tag Team Champions. The match was to have signaled a friendly split for the Harts, as Bret would have kicked off his singles run, hence the Survivor Series booking that had him going shot for shot with DiBiase, while Neidhart would have transitioned into a commentary role. However, the title match was marred when, during the second fall, the top rope broke off the turnbuckle. For unknown reasons, and despite the angry pleas of the wrestlers, referee Fred Sparta would not halt the match so that the rope could be reattached. The second fall degenerated into an absolute mess as a result. The rope was finally restored for the third fall, but the damage had been done. With 30 less minutes of broadcast time, and with the match being largely unairable due to the wonky-looking second fall, McMahon decided to not only not air the match on any of his broadcasts, but also to keep the belts on the Harts for a little longer, thus extending Neidhart's in-ring run. Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty later went on to hold those titles with different partners, but never officially together as the Rockers. A cancelled title reign wasn't the worst part of Jannetty's autumn, as he was party to another infamous untelevised bout. Weeks after the title win would have aired at a TV taping in Tampa, a Rockers squash match ended in horrific fashion. While setting up enhancement talent Chuck Austin for the finish, Jannetty attempted his rocker dropper maneuver, only for inexperienced Austin to mistakenly try cutting a flip instead of laying out flat to take the move. The result was Austin landing squarely on his head, breaking his neck and causing paralysis. Austin went on to sue both the WWF and Jannetty. In 1994, a jury awarded him $26.7 million and ruled that Jannetty had to pay him $500,000. The WWF managed to get their number down to $10 million on appeal and subsequent settlement. Around the time the match was taped, Mr. Perfect regained the Intercontinental title from Kerry Von Erich. In a somewhat amusing note, Perfect's win was taped just days before Survivor Series, but because the match wasn't going to air until mid-December, Von Erich still carried the belt at the pay-per-view. Perfect entered into the world of wrestling video games in early 1991 as a playable character on WWF Superstars, the company's first ever Game Boy release. British developer Rare produced the game, as well as an NES counterpart, WrestleMania Challenge, that was released several months earlier. The somewhat deeper roster and inclusion of some finishers put Challenge leagues ahead of 1989's WrestleMania. And it wasn't just the video game output getting freshened up. More than 6 years into the lifespan of primetime wrestling, the quaint studio show most famous for the witty banter of Monsoon and Heenan was getting a makeover. Starting in mid-February 1991, primetime shifted to something a bit closer to the long-gone Tuesday Night Titans, with a studio audience, wrestler guests, and oddball comedy bits. McMahon took over the hosting duties from Monsoon and made it his mission to wear as many outlandish sweatsuits on the show as possible. Preceding primetime's format switch was the 1991 Royal Rumble in Miami. At one juncture, Andre the Giant was booked as an entrant in the match. The WWF decided to bring Andre back after the legendary star had made several appearances for Herb Abrams' fledgling UWF promotion, as they didn't want somebody else to benefit from having one of their familiars. However, weeks after publicly announcing Andre as a match participant, the Eighth Wonder of the World was pulled from the Rumble due to health concerns. Andre taking part in the '91 Rumble would have been newsworthy. In all likelihood, though, it'd have been overshadowed by the WWF's fusion of real-life events and a questionable character arc. Halfway around the world, a major military conflict was brewing. In August of 1990, a Saddam Hussein-led Iraq invaded and annexed the much smaller neighboring country of Kuwait, beginning a months-long occupation. That November, the United Nations Security Council passed a resolution, giving Iraq until January 15th to peaceably withdraw from Kuwait or be forced out. Hussein would not budge, and by January 17th, Operation Desert Storm was underway. The United States was at the forefront of the coalition forces, aided by the United Kingdom, France, Saudi Arabia, and about 36 other countries. Concerns were global. A high body count among both armed personnel and civilians was expected. That year's Super Bowl, in which 74,000 fans would pack into Tampa Stadium, was held with the tightest security measures possible, bracing against a possible attack on American soil. Meanwhile, in the WWF, McMahon was staging his own proxy war over the promotion's richest prize. When Sergeant Slaughter returned to the WWF, his character expressed disgust with the subjective weakness of modern America, believing his homeland had grown soft and mellow in recent times. An amendment to that character had Slaughter hailing the brutish actions of Hussein and Iraq, openly siding with them. This turncoat version of Slaughter began wearing a keffiyeh, a traditional Middle Eastern headdress, to the ring, and was managed by Sheikh Adnan al-Qaisi, now renamed General Adnan. Adnan was legitimately from Baghdad and is said to have been a high school classmate of Hussein's. The WWF leaned into having Slaughter play an unlikely anti-American heel, waving the Iraq flag at TV tapings and appearing in a doctored photo with Hussein. At one juncture, Slaughter was supposed to burn an American flag, which he flat out refused to do. To compromise, Slaughter instead burned a Hogan t-shirt. With DiBiase using the Cobra Clutch as his finish, Slaughter needed a different hold. So, for a time, he actually finished opponents with a literal noogie to the temple. He later abandoned that roughhouse tactic in favor of old rival the Iron Sheik's Camel Clutch. 7 years earlier, the hated Sheik was the go-between from one babyface champion to Hogan, and history was about to repeat itself somewhat, minus much of those earlier good vibes. Some might say that the 1991 Royal Rumble was a pretty good event. After all, the Rockers and the Orient Express delivered one of the greatest opening matches in WWF pay-per-view history. Virgil finally turned on Ted DiBiase after months of abuse and got the crowd response of a lifetime for it. And we can't forget Bobby Heenan's masterful no-look catch of Mr. Perfect's towel during the Rumble match itself. None of those, of course, were the big story coming out of the Rumble. Occurring less than 72 hours after the commencement of Desert Storm, the Rumble, like much of America itself, was brimming with patriotic fervor. Fan signs throughout the Miami arena expressed well wishes for the fighting men and women. The national anthem was played at the start of the broadcast. Hogan dedicated his performance in the Rumble match to all the troops stationed overseas. And of course, the man caricatured as an Iraqi sympathizer won the WWF title. Slaughter defeated Warrior for the belt with an extreme assist from Savage, whom Warrior pissed off by refusing to grant a title shot. The Macho King bashed a prone Warrior with his regal scepter, allowing Slaughter to finish off the crumpled champion, claiming the belt as his own. The heat for Slaughter winning was enormous, but was it the good kind of heat? Many in the WWF disagreed with the direction of Slaughter's character, as well as the exploitation of an ongoing conflict. Wrestling had long trotted out foreign menaces for the defenders of Americana to vanquish, but to play that card when the bloodshed in the Middle East was only starting to mount felt a little sleazy. Dave Meltzer reported at the time that several key figures in WWF's front office had tried to get McMahon to change the Rumble match's booking to have Warrior win, and if not that, then alter Slaughter's character to be less egregiously on the nose. The fear of public reprisal was real, but McMahon wouldn't change paths. The plan for WrestleMania 7 was to fill the 100,000-seat Los Angeles Coliseum to see Super Patriot and 91 Rumble winner Hogan obliterate Hussein analog Slaughter for the title, God, and country. If the thinking was that a record crowd would pay to see Hogan win this war of sorts, then reality was about to bite hard. After drawing more than 60,000 fans to Toronto's Skydome for WrestleMania 1 year earlier, by the last week of January 1991, the WWF had only sold between 11,900 and 15,000 seats for WrestleMania 7. The WWF quietly decided to move WrestleMania from the Coliseum to the much smaller Los Angeles Sports Arena, which they were in striking distance of actually filling. Because so few seats had been sold to the Coliseum, no refunds had to be issued following the move. The official line from the WWF was security concerns due to the Coliseum being an outdoor venue. While it is true that Slaughter was receiving death threats over his character, almost all commentators agree that the poor ticket sales were the true facilitator for the move. At least one person pulled out of WrestleMania due to the booking, NBC host and sportscaster Bob Costas. Scheduled to take part in a light-hearted sketch debating the need for instant replay in wrestling, Costas bowed out of the event in early March, telling the Miami Herald, "Under the circumstances, I don't think doing the show would be in the best of taste." Nothing was going the WWF's way in regards to WrestleMania 7. The annual main event special on NBC designed to lead into WrestleMania didn't even air on NBC's LA affiliate due to round-the-clock coverage of a fatal runway collision at Los Angeles International Airport earlier that day. The rest of the country got to see Hogan get named #1 contender, only to be beaten down with a chair by new champion Slaughter later in the night. Beneath Hogan's Slaughter on the WrestleMania card was a match with drastic implications. After Savage cost Warrior the title at the Rumble, tensions continued flaring between the two, culminating in the challenge for a match in which the loser had to retire. One former WWF champion was going to have to hang it up in defeat. In championship action, IC title holder Mr. Perfect would defend against the Big Boss Man, the culmination of Boss Man's trek through the entire Heenan family that began the prior autumn, that began with, if you can believe it, Heenan making fat jokes about Boss Man's mother. For the tag team gold, the Hearts would defend against the Nasty Boys, who had won a 7-team battle royal to earn the shot. Meanwhile, an already eliminated Power and Glory cost the Legion of Doom said battle royal, which spun off into their own WrestleMania encounter. Two other heated grudges were set to pay off in LA. Roberts and Martel's months-long rivalry would be settled in a blindfold match, a fitting coda to the story of Martel blinding Jake with his personalized cologne, Arrogance. Meanwhile, an injured Roddy Piper was playing the Mickey Goldmill to Virgil's Rocky Balboa, as the Hot Rod coached Virgil up for his showdown against abusive ex-employer DiBiase. In face-offs without an angle, the Rockers were matched up with Haku and the Barbarian, while Smash and Crush of Demolition drew a duo from the affiliated SWS promotion in Japan, the legendary Genichiro Tenryu and former sumo bad boy Koji Kitao. The British Bulldog was booked to face fellow powerhouse The Warlord, while the Mountie would face a barely treading Tito Santana. Aimless Dino Bravo and Texas Tornado were paired up, while Earthquake was put in a pretty obvious squash against Greg Valentine. And rounding out the card was Superfly Jimmy Snuka getting notched as the first ever WrestleMania opponent of The Undertaker. By now, Undertaker had changed managers, going from Brother Love to Percy Pringle, who had guided Taker earlier in his career. But to make the new advisor fit the Undertaker motif, Pringle became the Gomez Adams-looking Paul Bearer, and this was just as well, seeing as the real-life William Moody had been a licensed mortician outside of wrestling. WrestleMania was scheduled for March 24th, but Operation Desert Storm effectively ended on February 28th, with the coalition claiming victory. By March 10th, more than 500,000 US soldiers began moving out of the Persian Gulf, and 2 weeks later, it was time for WrestleMania 7, where Hogan was booked to upend the Rebel without a cause. Subtitled Stars and Stripes Forever, WrestleMania 7 was a mania like no other. That much was apparent when country music legend Willie Nelson sang America the Beautiful while dressed as a WWF merchandise stand. The undercard proved mostly robust. The Rockers defeated Haku and Barbarian in a breathless opener before Von Erich downed Bravo in a clunky follow-up. Bulldog overpowered Warlord before the Nasty Boys upset the Hearts to capture the tag team titles. This match marked the official end of the Hart Foundation, as the Hitman began his genuine singles push while Neidhart moved over to the commentary booth. In the days after Mania, Hart officially adopted the Sharpshooter as his new finish, after being taught the hold in the locker room by Conan, who was going through a series of tryouts with the company. Next up, a hooded Roberts defeated a hooded Martel in a somewhat polarizing blindfold match. On the one hand, some enjoyed the element of audience participation as Roberts relied on crowd noise to figure out where Martel was. Others lamented that the match was as action-packed as watching paint dry. Nonetheless, Roberts put Martel down with the DDT and happily wrapped Damien around in post-match. On his 26th birthday, The Undertaker picked up what seemed at the time like an inconsequential victory when he put away Snuka in a matter of minutes. Of course, history would come to underline this match as the birth of the storied WrestleMania streak that would persist for over 2 decades. Warrior vs. Savage was next, and it was the perfect slice of WrestleMania history. Warrior's entrance was unique simply for the fact that he walked instead of running, conserving every bit of energy before the fight of his life. The back of his trunks were adorned with an airbrushed WWF title captioned with the words, "Means much more than this." From there, a psychologically sound battle for the ages played out, as high tension and a sense of caution filled in for the usual devil-may-care craziness each headliner was known for. Things grew more tense when Warrior somehow kicked out of 5 flying elbow smashes. Then, when Savage kicked out of Warrior's multi-pronged finishing sequence, Warrior began questioning the gods above him. Savage tried taking advantage of the spiritually distracted Warrior, but an attempted diving axe handle to the floor proved to be his undoing. He hit the guardrail and Warrior took over, shoulder tackling what was left of the Macho King before finishing him with a boot across the chest. Savage's career was over, but the real-life Randy Poffo was cool with that. At 38, he coveted a normal home life with real-life wife Elizabeth. Speaking of the long-absent Elizabeth, she had a role to play in a rather fitting curtain call. Just before the career-ending match, commentator Heenan alerted Monsoon to Elizabeth's presence in the recesses of the LA Sports Arena crowd. Appearing understandably anxious, Liz, who hadn't been with the WWF full-time in 2 years, watched on as Savage and Warrior carried out their dance of death. Looking suitably disconsolate in Savage's defeat, Elizabeth watched as an irate Sherry began attacking a battered, defenseless Savage as he lay on the canvas. Usually not one to get physical, Elizabeth jumped the rail, bolted to the ring, and sent Sherry flying to the outside. Savage saw none of this, so when Elizabeth tried helping him up, he jumped up and assumed a fighting stance, before realizing who stood across from him. Fans quickly picked up on the significance, urging Savage to reunite with his lost love. And of course, he did, bringing the house down with an all-time WrestleMania moment. It wasn't hard for the WWF's camera crew to find fans that were legitimately in tears either. In a twist on their earlier chauvinistic arrangement, this time Savage insisted on holding the ropes open for Elizabeth, a character touch that completed the Macho Man's babyface turn. If he never wrestled again, at least he'd get to leave a hero alongside the woman he loved. Unfortunately, WrestleMania couldn't end there. After an excellent first half, WrestleMania started limping along a bit. Smash and Crush lost to Tenryu and Katao in a very heatless match in what was Demolition's final televised outing together. Bossman defeated Perfect via cheap disqualification in a match more notable for Andre making one last WrestleMania appearance as a counter to Heenan's cheating. Earthquake flattened Valentine before LOD polished off Hercules and Roma in under a minute. Virgil defeated DiBiase via countout in a match more memorable for its chaotic aftermath. And after the Mountie used his cattle prod to subdue Santana, the war over the gold took center stage. Somehow, Alex Trebek doing ring announcing and Regis Philbin adding guest commentary didn't lend much gravitas to the quest for star-spangled revenge. Then again, Slaughter couldn't have been a more lame duck champion. The change of venue indicated as much. For what it was, Hogan vs. Slaughter was a decent brawl, accentuated by Hulk bleeding after doing a blade job right on camera. But a little crimson wasn't going to allay the inevitable, as Slaughter fell victim to the time-tested Hulk finishing sequence. For the third time, Hogan was WWF champion. And as far as the storytellers were concerned, all was right with the world. Things were a little bit different on the business front though. At 400,000 buys, WrestleMania 7 was down 29% from a year earlier, and was even down from the Rumble's 440,000 buys. As it stands, 1991 is only one of 3 years in which the Rumble drew more buys than WrestleMania, the others being 1997 and 2003. Running in front of a mostly empty LA Coliseum would have been the cherry on top of a less than middling Sunday. McMahon did get his stadium show before month's end, co-promoting the Tokyo Dome with Tenryu's Super World of Sports promotion. WWF SWS WrestleFest took place the Saturday following Mania, and was a fairly strong supercard all things considered. The attendance was announced at 64,618, which is Federation slang for 42,000 with 25,000 paid and a ton of freebies. Still, that's quite the crowd in a country where the WWF didn't even have TV. Among the standout matches was another Hart Foundation vs. Rockers clash before Brett continued his solo ascent stateside. The now retired Savage worked one of his final matches defeating George Takano, a one-time WWF Junior Heavyweight Champion, as the Masked Cobra. And the main event saw the Legion of Doom defeat Hogan and Tenryu in an excellent brawl, blemished only by a count-out finish. Surprisingly, the biggest babyface on the show might just have been Earthquake. That's because he wrestled the aforementioned Katao, who was soundly disliked by Japanese fans for his disappointing sumo career and his subsequent banishment from the sport. Earthquake may as well have been a conquering hero as he put away the reviled Katao in 6 minutes. 2 nights later, Earthquake and Katao faced off once more, this time in Kobe for another joint show entitled Wrestle Dream. And this encounter proved far more notable. Katao was angry about having to do a second job for Earthquake, and so he stubbornly refused to cooperate. The two super heavyweights circled each other in a confusing standoff, exchanging verbal threats and making threatening gestures. Katow also threw some unpulled kicks at Earthquake's legs. When the referee tried to make Katow lock up with Quake, he too was kicked for his troubles. This resulted in Katow being disqualified, to which he grabbed the ringside microphone and angrily proclaimed that Earthquake and pro wrestling were totally fake. Unsurprisingly, Katow was fired from SWS after that whole fiasco, and the incident made national headlines. Katow wasn't going to be making any more cross-promotional appearances with the WWF, but a pretty sizable incoming class was going to have room to shine, as the likes of Bravo, Crush, Haku, Valentine, Snooker, and Neidhart, on top of the retired Savage, either left the WWF or were shunted down to the lower card, and that left more than a few openings. A familiar face popped back up in the form of Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. However, curiously, Steamboat's character history was mostly ignored, and he was almost always referred to solely as the Dragon during this run. Though the fire-breathing entrance was a nice touch, the WWF's decision to downplay a very recognizable star and former Intercontinental Champion in Steamboat made little sense. He wasn't the only former champion to get that sort of confounding makeover either. Post-Mania, Slaughter and Adnan continued their lifeless tactical campaign and adopted a new cohort, the Iron Sheik. Except he was no longer the Iron Sheik. He was now Colonel Mustafa. On one occasion, Monsoon recognized Mustafa as Sheik, but after that, the former WWF World and Tag Team Champion pretty much played a completely different character. Rounding out a trifecta of scrubbed histories for former champions, two-time WWF Tag Team Champion Mike Rotunda came back in the spring, though his new identity is arguably how he's best remembered today. In a series of vignettes, the audience was introduced to Erwin R. Shyster, the smarmy and snide tax collector that would love nothing more than to audit all the tax cheats in insert location of WWF event here. A human dragon, an angry colonel, and a suspender-wearing government agent. Sounds like the beginning of a walk into a bar joke. One can't help but notice a lot more hands-on character development on the WWF's part, and a lot more cartoonish hues. Tag team veteran Steve Kern showed up as Skinner, a chore-spewing gator hunter from the Florida Everglades. AWA heavyweight John Nord began toting around a sword and shield as a wacky Viking called the Berserker. The furry boots and incessant hussing made Berserker look like little more than a dollar store Bruiser Brody, and really, that's what he was. Speaking of displaced talents from the now-defunct AWA, Wayne Bloom and Mike Enos of the Destruction Crew were given matching purple tights and a kayfabe genetic connection, becoming Bo and Blake Beverly, two spoon-fed snots from Shaker Heights, Ohio. They were originally managed by long-retired grappler the Golden Greek John Tolos, who was costumed as a generic football coach. And his new name? Coach. Plucked from the upstart GWF promotion in Dallas was former powerlifter Big Bully Busick. The Bully was a generic turn-of-the-century roughneck that chomped on a giant cigar and wore a bowler hat that complemented a double-thick mustache. Busick was managed by the also debuting Dr. Harvey Whippleman, whose red bow tie and plain-looking suit appeared to be a nod to Pee Wee Herman, who had recently made headlines for, very adult reasons. As mentioned earlier, Conan received several tryouts in the period, working dark matches with Louis Spicolli, but not as the Conan that many fans knew. Instead, the future K-Dog dressed as, I guess, a Mega Man / Metroid / Statue of Liberty looking spaceman thing? For the year and a half that followed, the WWF and Conan continued to revisit the intergalactic theme before settling upon what would become known as Max Moon. Unfortunately, Conan quit around that time, so they gave the gimmick to Paul Diamond, simply because he fit into the costume. The biggest pre-summer acquisition stood at 6 feet 9 inches tall and had the look of a future world champion. WCW agreed, which is why they tried to re-sign this talent before he bolted to the WWF. But New York wrestling seemed to be this man's destiny. Sid Vicious made the leap after putting over El Gigante at May's Super Brawl in a stretcher match, notable for Sid not even leaving on the stretcher. Soon, the master and ruler of the world, now renamed Sid Justice, was making WWF dark match appearances, pummeling DiBiase and the Mountie. The home viewer wouldn't get to see Sid in action until later in the summer, so until then, they were treated to some rather demented angles, even by the WWF standards. One saw Earthquake kill Jake Roberts' snake, Damien. During a TV bout, Quake was annoyed by Roberts' earlier attempt at scaring him with the snake, and chose to exact revenge in the most harrowing way possible. With Roberts tied in the ropes by the arms, Quake delivered multiple vertical splashes on the bag containing Damien, which in reality, according to John Tenter, was actually pantyhose stuffed with hamburger meat. The viewers were none the wiser when a tearful Roberts finally opened the bag in the aftermath and recoiled at the sight inside. Earthquake followed up his dastardly act by making hamburgers out of Damien and serving them to the hosts of primetime wrestling. No, really, he had an apron and a chef's hat and everything. For Roberts' part, he debuted a new snake named Lucifer, continuing what turned out to be a rather brief feud with Quake in late June. A similarly disturbing angle saw Undertaker attack the Ultimate Warrior on the set of Paul Bearer's interview segment, The Funeral Parlor. The centerpiece of the set was a narrow casket that Undertaker sealed Warrior inside of. Bearer locked the casket lid down before departing the funeral parlor alongside Taker. After a couple of excruciating minutes, the lid was finally busted open by WWF officials, and viewers saw the Warrior lying near motionless after vainly clawing at the padded inner lining. Eventually, Undertaker and Warrior would battle in the WWF's first ever casket matches, which became Undertaker's signature bout. On a lighter note, a now babyface Savage proposed to Miss Elizabeth in an oft-quoted segment, famous for Savage leaving off the H when pronouncing his real-life spouse's name. But on a heavier note, Tugboat turned heel, joining up with Earthquake to form the Natural Disasters, together billed at over 850 pounds. To accommodate the team's destructive motif, Tugboat became Typhoon. All of these noteworthy TV moments occurred on the weekend syndicated programs. For the foreseeable future, the WWF wasn't going to have Saturday night's main event in their rotation, due to their deal with NBC coming to an end. Ratings continued to sag throughout 1990 and into 1991, and the final NBC broadcast aired on April 27th, just shy of the 6-year anniversary. Shortly after that, the WWF entered negotiations with several outlets to continue the show, with Fox ultimately picking up the rights to Saturday night's main event for a brief run in 1992. One positive: arcade goers entered the summer of 1991 with a chance to enjoy WWF WrestleFest, the sequel to 1989's Superstars. With a selection of 12 wrestlers and some of the most vibrant graphics possible for the time, WrestleFest proved to be one of the WWF's all-time most popular games, in part due to the first ever depiction of a Royal Rumble match in any video game. Times were a little less merry in the offices of the WWF, however, particularly when somebody once associated with the company was sent to prison. In late June, Dr. George T. Zahorian III, a Pennsylvania-based osteopath and urological surgeon, was convicted on 12 counts of illegally distributing controlled substances, chiefly steroids. Zahorian first came under investigation following the arrest of one-time client William Dunn, a strength coach at the University of Virginia that had been caught forging prescriptions for painkillers. With Dunn's cooperation, the government started building a case against the doctor. In March 1990, the FBI raided Zahorian's offices. Months earlier, when the WWF got wind that Zahorian was being looked at by the feds, Linda McMahon circulated a memo that called for disassociation from him. Zahorian had a long-standing connection with the WWF. Since the mid-70s, Zahorian had presided over federation cards in the state on behalf of the Pennsylvania State Athletic Commission. It was at these events that Zahorian, in addition to checking the vitals of the wrestlers in accordance with his job, would do business. The client list of Zahorian read like a who's who. Piper, Hogan, and McMahon himself were all customers of Dr. George. Bret Hart detailed some of his own purchases from Zahorian in his 2007 memoirs and remembers the long lines of wrestlers outside his makeshift office. Piper, along with Martel and former WWF stars Brian Blair and Dan Spivey, all testified at the trial that they'd purchased steroids from Zahorian. Hogan didn't have to testify. Attorney Jerry McDevitt argued that Hulk taking the stand was unnecessary, as he wasn't accused of any wrongdoing, and his presence at the trial could harm the WWF by proxy. Federal Judge William Caldwell agreed, excusing the reigning WWF champion from testimony. McDevitt said that the prosecution didn't need Hogan to make their case, and he turned out to be right. The jury deliberated only 3 hours before convicting Zahorian on 12 of the 14 charges. The doctor was sentenced to 3 years behind bars. While Hogan was spared a good deal of potential embarrassment by not having to take the stand, he was still the public face of an institution that was earning more and more sideways glances. One needn't be cynical to assume how the strongmen of the ring acquired much of their musculature, but with a convicted doctor in the news, the face of the WWF developed more than a few pronounced cracks. Days after McMahon announced through a New York Times op-ed that the WWF was enacting a new drug testing policy, Hogan appeared on the talk show of one Arsenio Hall for what many assumed would be some sort of mea culpa. But instead of taking a conciliatory tack, Hogan flat out lied about his steroid use. The man with the purported largest arms in the universe claimed that he'd only taken steroids 3 times, all many years ago for rehabilitating an arm injury. As Hall gently challenged Hogan on his claims, Hulk continued digging himself a hole, looking worse with each passing minute. Years later, Hogan wrote, "I was worried about destroying all the good I'd done with the Hulk Hogan character." He explained that he didn't want the kids who idolized him to think he was a fraud that did the opposite of his own oft-stated train, say your prayers, eat your vitamins code of living. And with the WWF now marketing literal Hulk Hogan vitamins, the jokes wrote themselves. In the months ahead, men like superstar Billy Graham and David Schultz countered Hogan's poorly constructed defense, each claiming to have personally injected the 3-time champ with synthetic hormone. The damage done by Hogan's hollow sit-down had just started to mount, and the public image of wrestling's most famous star began withering. At the same time, pro wrestling's other renowned world champion was in a unique predicament of his own, and it would lead him north before long. On Monday, July 1st, 1991, WCW parted ways with its world champion, the Nature Boy Ric Flair. Flair had long been at odds with showrunner and executive vice president Jim Herd over money, over placement on the card, and over presentation. Flair had refused Herd's demands to take a substantial pay cut on his next contract, and had also resisted attempts by Herd to update his look, going only so far as to cut his hair but nothing more. This impasse reached the summer, where Flair was expected to drop the title to the long uncrowned Lex Luger at July's Great American Bash pay-per-view. Both a title win and a definitive win over Flair would have helped Luger finally shed his long-applied choker label, legitimizing him as a top guy. Flair, for his part, was apparently more than willing to do the honors for Luger on that day in Baltimore. But suddenly, without much forewarning, the decision was made to cut ties with Flair 13 days before the Bash. The belt was then held up. This proved to be a monumental mistake on WCW's part. After all, why not just wait until after Flair loses to Luger to get rid of him? But Hurd was sick enough of Flair to authorize his release pre-Bash, and it didn't take long for that decision to bite him in the ass. When ring announcer Gary Michael Capetta announced at a New Jersey house show 2 nights later that Flair had been stripped of the title, the 6,000 fans on hand reacted with shock and anger. The crowd in Baltimore at the Bash spent most of the wretched card chanting "We want Flair," while poor Luger had to settle for defeating Barry Windham in a hastily assembled top contenders match to win the belt. Well, he won a belt, but not the belt. That's because Flair still had the big gold in his possession, and he was taking it with him. A messy legal battle ensued as Flair claimed pseudo-ownership of the belt due to the uncollected deposit that he'd put down in order to possess the title, something NWA champions had to do in good faith in order to ensure they wouldn't run off with the belt. Flair demanded his money back with accrued interest, and when Hurd balked, Flair told him to go screw himself. Until he got his money, Nate was just as happy to bring the championship to the WWF. He sent the physical belt to the company, and before anyone knew it, Bobby Heenan was parading around on WWF television clutching the gold, cautioning Hogan and the others that the real world's champion was on his way. The Turner side sent a cease and desist order to the WWF, which the Federation initially ignored. When Flair finally debuted on television that September, he proudly wore the championship he'd won in a WCW ring, but eventually the WWF had to acquiesce to WCW's legal threats. For subsequent on-screen appearances, the belt was digitally blurred out, explained in kayfabe as a ruling by President Jack Tunney, as the title was not recognized in WWF canon. Eventually, Flair did get his payoff with a substantial amount of interest, he noted, and so he sent the belt back. For the remainder of his time using an outsider belt to claim real world champion status, Flair used a modified WWF tag team title, which the TV blurring helped disguise. No matter what belt he carried or what his story was, the bigger story was that Ric Flair was in the WWF, the man most synonymous with their closest rival. With Flair due to begin wrestling Hogan on house shows in October, the main event tier in the WWF had become a very crowded place. However, one headliner was about to find himself on the outs with the promotion. Amid George Zahorian's conviction, Hulk Hogan's PR disaster, and Ric Flair's controversial entry into free agency, Vince McMahon received a bemused letter from one Ultimate Warrior. Warrior was disconcerted over his current lot in the WWF. The former champion felt undervalued, underpaid, and underappreciated, and let McMahon know his feelings in a strongly worded missive. He noted that prior attempts on his part to try and resolve their issues were met with indifference, and believed that he was not properly compensated for his part in making WrestleMania 7 a financial success. He then listed off several demands, including $550,000 to pay off his home, which he said would serve as his Mania payoff. He also asked for a lighter schedule and similar financial cuts for pay-per-views and merchandise that Hogan received. Warrior went so far as to threaten to no-show August's SummerSlam pay-per-view, in which he would team with Hogan in the most heavily promoted match. McMahon got back to Warrior days later, penning a peaceable letter that agreed to just about everything Warrior asked for, closing by writing, "I would like to express to you my deepest appreciation and admiration for you as a performer, as a member of the WWF family, as a man, and as my friend." With that matter apparently settled, it was full speed ahead to the 1991 SummerSlam, emanating from the company's Madison Square Garden home. SummerSlam's 405,000 pay-per-view buys were down 25% from a year earlier, but were actually a slight increase from that year's WrestleMania, the only time a SummerSlam has ever outdrawn the Mania from the same year. Nonetheless, a year of questionable storylines and questionable off-screen activity eroded some of the Federation's once sturdy sheen. Hogan and Warrior aligned for a handicap match against the not-so-subtly named Triangle of Terror, Slaughter, Adnan and Mustafa, and the result was just as predictable as Sunrise. The debuting Sid Justice was installed as special referee to try and build a little what will the new guy do intrigue, but otherwise this was the last gasp of a long dead storyline. That bout was dubbed the Match Made in Hell, one half of a unique twin bill. For SummerSlam, the WWF also promoted the Match Made in Heaven, in which Randy and Elizabeth Poffo would have kayfabe nuptials to match their real-life ones. Much of the SummerSlam card was rooted in big wins for babyface stars. In what was easily the greatest match of his career, Virgil defeated Ted DiBiase to win the $1 million title, all while Mentor Piper on commentary nearly screamed himself hoarse during the dramatic final sequence. The Legion of Doom won a no disqualification match over the Nasty Boys to become tag team champions, making them the only team to hold the WWF, NWA, and AWA World Tag Team belts. The Big Boss Man defeated fellow law enforcer the Mountie in a match where the loser had to spend the night in a New York City jail, aided through the night by humorous vignettes of Mountie being forced through processing while pleading in vain with the cops. Bret Hart made good on his new singles push, ending Mr. Perfect's 9-month reign as Intercontinental Champion via the Sharpshooter. Hart's landmark win came as Perfect's future looked uncertain. Curt Hennig missed most of the summer with a severely injured back, and returned long enough to gut his way through an 18-minute technical encounter. For the year plus that followed, Perfect was inactive, assuming managerial and commentary roles instead. There were also historic moments, from a big gold belt toting Heenan attempting to grandstand to Hogan, to Andre the Giant making his final stateside WWF appearance in a building he'd headlined in on many occasions. But the most unprecedented moment occurred after the final match of the night. Hogan and Warrior won a mostly humdrum affair against the so-called Triangle of Terror after Hogan pinned Slaughter. Referee Sid Justice was mostly a non-factor in the skirmish, though did show his babyface colors when he posed with Hogan during the post-match festivities. While Hogan and Sid shared the spotlight in that oddly wholesome moment, something far more troubling was happening behind the curtain. Just before Hogan finished off Slaughter, Warrior chased Adnan and Mustafa up the aisle and through the curtain with a folding chair, per the match's plan. Not long after making it backstage, however, Warrior was handed a letter apparently written that day. It was from Vince, and it informed Warrior that he was suspended indefinitely from the WWF. The soothing letter from Vince 6 weeks earlier was written solely to ensure that Warrior didn't no-show SummerSlam. Then, when his part of the planned match ended, McMahon dropped the hammer and made his disgust clear to Warrior. One part of the letter read, "You threatened to stay at home, thereby not even appearing at Titan's major summer pay-per-view event, SummerSlam. I had no choice but to accede to your exorbitant demands. This was a serious mistake on your part." The written notice also criticized Warrior for being delusional about his standing in the company, and for being difficult to work with. Instead of pivoting off this into a new rivalry with Undertaker and a heel-turned Jake Roberts, who'd recently double-crossed Warrior at the end of some truly morbid vignettes by luring him into a den of snakes, Warrior was going home for an indeterminate period. Fortunately, Roberts and Undertaker found a new direction quickly enough. Savage and Elizabeth married at night's end in perhaps the quaintest wrestling wedding ever. Then came the reception. The pay-per-view audience didn't see it, but some incredible footage made it onto the WWF's weekend programming. While opening gifts at an erstwhile serene wedding reception, Elizabeth pulled the lid off one gift box only to find a live cobra inside. Panic suddenly swept through the banquet room as Roberts and Undertaker stormed the reception, jumping Savage as everything descended into chaos. Sid was able to ward off the intruders with a chair, and a retired Macho Man now stood in amid the sudden absence of face paint and tassels. Savage didn't stay retired long. Despite reservations, McMahon did coax him back to the ring for another run in order to feud with Roberts, and boy did that lead to some unbelievable TV. The Macho Man began a reinstatement campaign asking WWF fans to convince Tunney to let him wrestle again, basically so that he could kill Jake. While a Savage look-alike named Mr. Madness battled Roberts in several untelevised bouts, the real Macho Man was forbidden from leaving his commentary post to attack Jake the Snake, as he was no longer an active wrestler. Like any good serpent, Roberts did lead a still inactive Savage into temptation that November, after finishing a squash match. Roberts goaded Savage into trying to attack him, only for Jake to quickly get the upper hand. After tying Savage into the ropes, Roberts produced a cobra, which in real life had been devenomized. The audience certainly didn't know that, as the snake legitimately chomped on the trapped Savage's arm, drawing blood from the appendage and shrieks and gasps from the crowd in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Elizabeth, Piper, and a horde of officials tried to intervene, only to be held at bay by the cobra-wielding Roberts. Commentator McMahon's voice raised several phlegmy octaves, underscoring what felt like a life-and-death situation. After an eternity, the mob managed to rescue Savage and get him onto a stretcher, which he did fall off once in a bit of unintentional comedy. The segment served to hammer home one objective point: that Jake Roberts was a sick, devious son of a bitch. Though even he wasn't immune to the fangs of the Cobra. Prior to running the angle, a distrustful, paranoid Savage convinced Roberts to let the snake bite himself, to prove that it was devenomized. Painful as it was, Jake complied, and it got Savage on board for one of the most insane segments ever aired on WWF programming. The first encounter between Hogan and Flair didn't need the threat of a snakebite, it just needed the allure of history in the making. While the two had something of a dry run in a dark match at a Dayton, Ohio TV taping, the first recognized Hogan-Flair bout drew nearly 15,000 fans to the Oakland Arena on Friday, October 25th. For the next month, the two icons battled at house shows all across the country, though none of the matches ever ended with a clean, conclusive winner. A week before the Cobra incident, Flair confronted Hogan on the set of The Funeral Parlor, which made an unusual backdrop to one of wrestling's most historically profound confrontations. The crux of the face-off was to allow Undertaker a chance to attack the WWF champion from behind, but the summit was nonetheless a surreal visual for anyone that grew up reading glorified WWF versus WCW fanfiction in the Aptamags. For that angle, Undertaker strode out of a standing casket on the set, but a month earlier, Undertaker made an even cooler entrance inside a rather unique venue. The WWF hit up Europe for a fondly remembered tour, with London's Royal Albert Hall playing host to the main course. For a singles bout with Hacksaw Jim Duggan, Undertaker made his entrance to a live organ rendition of his theme music. The organist was even dressed as the Phantom of the Opera for the occasion. The obvious star of the tour was Davey Boy Smith, treated as a major deal by Federation crowds across the pond. The Royal Albert Hall card ended with the Bulldog winning a battle royal, last eliminating Typhoon. 6 nights later in Paris, Smith defeated Earthquake with an assist from cornerman and France's own Andre the Giant. The appearance was fitting, as it marked the final time Andre ever appeared on a WWF card, doing so in his home country. Perhaps the strangest result from the European tour occurred in Madrid, when the usually unbeatable Undertaker lost in the main event via pinfall to undercard occupant Tito Santana. It was a spirited match in which Santana looked like a world-beating headliner, pile-driving Undertaker several times and even smashing him with the urn before scoring the upset victory. Back home, Santana was getting outfitted for a new character. As he recalls, well over a year earlier, Vince proposed the idea of turning him into a colourful matador, which Santana claims was originally NBC executive Dick Ebersol's idea. It wasn't until mid-1991 that Santana went off to learn the ins and outs of how to play a convincing bullfighter. Footage of Santana's training aired in vignettes through the autumn of 1991. In the end, Santana ditched the generic white trunks and boots for long green tights with gold adornment, and black boots with hot pink wraps. Sporting a green coat and carrying a florid bullfighter's cape, Santana was officially reborn as El Matador, entering to a festive and bold trumpet score. Another veteran star got a character overhaul, one that cast him as someone completely different than the three-time tag team champion he once played. Demolition Smash toiled in singles matches on the summer house show circuit before cutting his hair short and replacing the war paint with a Lone Ranger mask. That autumn, Smash was reborn as Repo Man, a maniacal car thief that struck fear into the hearts of America's deadbeats. Contra to Smash's surlier, more threatening speech tones, the Repo Man spoke as though he were hopped up on helium, punctuating his high-pitched monologues with a laugh liberally borrowed from Frank Gorshin's Riddler. Though a cartoonish heel with a low ceiling, it was hard to hate Repo Man in all of his glorious lunacy. Also getting a cosmetic change was primetime wrestling, after just 9 months of the studio audience format. The third and final, as it turned out, iteration of Primetime was a discussion panel where Vince sat at the head of a conference table. One side of the table provided the babyface talking points, typically Monsoon and another individual like Duggan, Hillbilly Jim, or a face turned Slick, while Heenan and Mr. Perfect, both of whom were acting as Flair's advisors, stuck up for the heels. It wasn't the prime time of old, but at least Monsoon and Heenan got to comically bicker once more. And Perfect had it made, getting paid to sit there and laugh at Heenan's jokes. What could be better? Certainly the Survivor Series. That could have been better, for sure. The 5th annual Survivors card, the first to air on Thanksgiving Eve instead of night, was an objective mess. For one thing, the best match of the night was the 4-on-4 opener pitting teams captained by Flair and Piper against each other, but it came to an abrupt end when 5 wrestlers were hastily disqualified at the same time, leaving Flair as the fortunate survivor. Slower, more ponderous action filled the rest of the card, one riddled with a ton of substitutions. Steamboat had quit the company after 7 months, opening up a spot on Duggan's team for the newly branded El Matador. A kayfabe injury to a returned Neidhart allowed for a face-turned Slaughter, embracing the good old US of A once more, to join Hacksaw's squad as well. Busick left only months into his WWF run, so Hercules, now solo after Paul Roma quit, joined Colonel Mustafa's team. Sid Justice was supposed to captain a team of Bossman and LOD against Roberts, IRS, and the Natural Disasters, but sustained a torn biceps in October. You'd think that a reinstated Savage would be the perfect choice to slot in as the new captain, seeing as, he'd want to rip Jake apart over the whole Cobra biting the arm thing. But instead, Jack Tunney announced that Roberts was being pulled from the match due to his unprofessional conduct, and that the elimination match, which ended up going on last, was now 3-on-3. Seeing as none of the 6 remaining wrestlers were involved in any sort of heated angle, this made for quite the milquetoast night ender. Savage would get Roberts, but the match would take place at an experimental pay-per-view in San Antonio 6 nights later, plainly titled This Tuesday in Texas. The WWF wanted to see if they could use one pay-per-view to quickly turn around and promote a sequel of sorts, and thus decided to save the Savage-Roberts grudge match for then. Another big match was slated for the Tuesday card, but needed an impetus within Survivor Series to make it so. For the first time ever, the November pay-per-view featured a non-elimination bout. Hogan, 8 months into the weakest of his 3 reigns as champion, defended the WWF Gold against The Undertaker, hence Survivor Series' subtitle of The Gravest Challenge. And by this stage of the game, fans were turning on Hogan. While Hogan's disastrous TV interview certainly had a big hand in dimming his wattage, you could just as easily add that Hulk was 8 years into his run as WWF's infallible superhero. Hogan had nothing new to say, reciting the same bombastic platitudes while his audience seemed to be thinning in direct correlation to his hairline. Not only that, but The Undertaker was just so fresh. Though a monster heel, Undertaker was so unique, so fascinating, that Hogan's stale routine couldn't help but pale to the meticulous swagger of the Phenom. And the fans at Detroit's Joe Louis Arena expressed as such. Among the 17,000 plus on hand, crowd reaction was roughly 60-40 in Undertaker's favor, as Hogan still had his fans, but pronounced jeers could be heard through the positive din. The WWF even went so far as to confiscate 2 pro-Undertaker banners before the pay-per-view, as they would have been highly visible on the hard camera. The WWF knew Hogan was image wounded and booked him strong. He even no-sold a tombstone piledriver, popping up after a split second, prompting an all-time classic pallbearer look of horror. A second tombstone did the trick, as an interfering Flair held a steel chair in place on the mat so Taker could spike Hogan on it. Hogan's head never hit the seat, but he did manage to legitimately jam his neck when his head was embedded against the Undertaker's leg during the execution of the move. And when the folded hand pin led to the desired 3 count, there were more than a few audible cheers. When Heenan boldly decreed that Hulkamania is dead, there was a growing number of fans hoping he was right. Clearly, the man at the top was no longer man of the hour, as Survivor Series did just 300,000 buys, a 25% drop from the 1990 card that Undertaker debuted on. But Hogan did get his rematch. During a long intermission segment, Tunney ruled that because of Flair's interference, Hulk would challenge Undertaker at the San Antonio card the following week. Between the immediate rematch and the holding off of Savage and Roberts, who both cut promos during Survivor Series to hype their Tuesday showdown, this Big Four tentpole came off feeling more like an infomercial than a destination event. For what it was, this Tuesday in Texas was a solid pay-per-view, sort of a premium Saturday night's main event. Decent mid-card action surrounded the 2 big bouts, one of which proved historic and one that pushed boundaries. Roberts vs. Savage was an intense 6.5-minute scrap that always felt like a fight. Macho jumped Jake in the aisleway before the match, and what followed was just between the lines enough to constitute a lawful wrestling match. Savage did win clean, but the fallout is what gives it its legend. A vengeful Roberts DDT'd Savage 3 times post-match before going under the ring and retrieving the bag that contained his Cobra. A horrified Miss Elizabeth begged and pleaded for Roberts to relent, and Jake demanded that she continued begging on her unconscious man's behalf, seemingly getting his jollies from her anguish. Then, in an unforgettable moment, a suddenly angry Roberts pulled Elizabeth to her feet and, after berating her further, struck her in the face. You know a heel's gone too far when even Heenan won't defend their actions on commentary. 1991 Jake was quite simply unlike any bad guy that had ever set foot in a WWF ring. In the aftermath, both wrestlers cut very different promos. A panting, satisfied Roberts wickedly recounted the moment in breathless tones, and, bearing a sick smile, asked Savage to bring Elizabeth back so that he could have that pleasure once more. Mean Gene basically ordered him off the interview set after that. Later, a furious, pacing Savage couldn't string together a coherent sentence, all too consumed with murderous rage. He even dropped down to the set's floor, totally distraught that he couldn't stop Roberts from putting his hand on his wife. For all the intensity on display between Savage and Roberts, Hogan vs. Undertaker 2 was as middling and as textbook as it could have been. A long, draining match concluded with Hogan winning his 4th WWF title after throwing some of the urn's ashes into Undertaker's eyes and pinning him with a roll-up. Tony was present at ringside during the match to nullify any chicanery, but was knocked out at one juncture. The cheating made it past his filters, but not for long. By the weekend, Tony stripped Hogan of the title. He announced that the winner of the 1992 Royal Rumble would claim the vacated belt, making it the first Rumble match to have genuine stakes. The WWF ended 1991 in a very different place than it entered. Their all-time biggest star was reeling from a PR debacle. The WWF champion entering the year was indefinitely suspended and on sour terms with the company. An armed conflict served as the backdrop to WrestleMania, repelling many fans in the process, and the conviction of a once-associated doctor on steroid charges made the company very wary about who, what, and how they promoted going forward. It honestly seemed like things couldn't get much worse, but in 1992, they did. The Golden Age was coming to an end. By early in the year, word was out that Hogan was looking at a sabbatical, taking an indefinite leave of absence to see if the negative press and acquired stigma would eventually blow over. In a year where Johnny Carson would vacate his Tonight Show chair after 30 years, World Wrestling Federation fans were going to have to get used to a WWF color scheme sans the familiar red and yellow. And love him or hate him, a Hoganless WWF was hard to fathom in 1992. A few reinforcements popped up during the calendar flip. After 2.5 years away, Owen Hart returned without the blue blazer getup. He traded in the sky blue mask and singlet for glorified pajama pants and a baggy ringcoat as he teamed with brother-in-law Jim Neidhart to form the New Foundation. Derivative as it may have been, Owen and the Anvil made for a potent duo, until Neidhart was fired in February for refusing to take a drug test. For the time being, the youngest Hart sibling had to go it alone. Plucked from Dallas's GWF was Conan Chris Walker, an archetype of the early 90s muscle man. Seldom did Walker make it past house show outings and dark matches, and was soon let go for reasons that will become clear. Someone with longer-lasting power was Tatanka. A member of North Carolina's Lumbee tribe, Tatanka's heritage defined his WWF persona. He was portrayed as a proud and fearless warrior that earnestly bested his opponents while quietly amassing a considerable win streak. On the side of evil stood Papa Shango, a mordant voodoo man that borrowed heavily from James Bond villain Baron Samedi. With skull print makeup and a number of macabre accessories like a skull that billowed smoke, Shango had the ability to place curses on his opponents, though not in a fun Danhausen sort of way. Owen, Tatanka, and Shango would have room to stretch their feet out over the months and years ahead, because big changes to the locker room were coming. Marty Jannetty found himself on the outside for the time being after a January altercation with police outside a nightclub in Orlando. The incident occurred just weeks after one of the most famous tag team splits in history was broadcast. The Rockers began falling out at the 1991 Survivor Series when Jannetty inadvertently caused Shawn Michaels' elimination. Michaels began acting crude and callous to Jannetty over the weeks ahead, and more miscues followed. Hostilities flared to the point where Michaels and Jannetty appeared on the set of The Barbershop, hosted by a still recovering but miraculously healthy Brutus Beefcake. There, Michaels feigned reconciliation with Jannetty before super kicking him out of nowhere. Then, with Jannetty dazed, Michaels snatched him by the back of the head and sent him flying through the barbershop window, resulting in Jannetty lying in a bloody heap. The Rockers had drifted apart outside the ring as well, as while neither man was a choir boy, Jannetty's habits had apparently worn on Michaels, and the man soon to be reborn as the Heartbreak Kid coveted a deserved solo run. Unfortunately, because Jannetty was due to serve 6 months of house arrest following the Orlando skirmish, the follow-up to the barbershop attack was put on ice. Michaels was one of 30 entrants in the Royal Rumble match to crown a new WWF champion. From a kayfabe perspective, there were several viable winners, including Hogan, Undertaker, Savage, Flair, Piper, Roberts, Davey Boy, DiBiase, Bossman, Duggan, Slaughter, Sid, a real murderer's row of top guys and beloved veterans. The only singles wrestler not entered that had a sporting chance of winning was reigning IC champ Bret, who was booked to defend his title against the Mountie at the Rumble. Instead, Hart didn't even work the show at all. 2 days before the Rumble, Hart lost the title at a house show in Springfield, Massachusetts to the Mountie, while purportedly working with a high fever. The otherwise clean loss protected Hart in a loss to a comedic character, and was step one of a unique plan. Mountie would then drop the title to new challenger Piper, filling in for the sick Hitman at the Rumble, who would go on to lose the title to Hart in a face versus face battle at WrestleMania 8. Seeing as Piper almost never lost to anybody via clean pinfall, this would be a huge coup for Bret. In the same time frame, Hart had considered a move to WCW for monetary reasons after family confidant Brian Pillman informed him of what he was earning there. But when WCW didn't make an offer to his liking, Hart chose to stay with the WWF. Seeing how the rest of 1992 played out for Hart, that was good thinking. As it stood, in the final days of the WWF title's vacancy, the Mountie enjoyed a near 48-hour period of being the top singles champion in the WWF, and as planned, Piper put him down at the Rumble in Albany to capture his first ever championship in the WWF. If you ever want to hear an ungodly crowd response, check out when Howard Finkel bellows, "And new!" following Piper's victory. Talk about a career victory lap moment for an all-time great. From Piper's perspective, he now had a chance at winning 2 singles titles in one night. He was one of the bigger names in the all-important 30-man Rumble, but those who followed the sheets had an inkling as to who was gonna win. Flair made perfect sense as a winner, as he could theoretically face Hogan in a title bout at WrestleMania, depending on where things stood with the rumored sabbatical. And after months of boasting that he was the real world's champion, what better way to back up his claim by surviving a star-studded field? The self-stylized 60-minute man was built for a long run inside the Rumble. According to Heenan, he pitched the idea of having Flair enter at number 1, which he said prompted McMahon to instead have Flair enter 3rd, to make it Vince's own idea, Heenan explains. While his pitch wasn't followed to the letter, the spirit of it was employed. Meanwhile, Heenan had a major role to play in said Rumble match, providing some of the most entertaining heel commentary ever. Selling the idea that he and Perfect had everything riding on Flair coming out on top, the brain blew a gasket when Flair strode out the curtain at number 3. First entrant Bulldog eliminated second entry DiBiase and waited as Flair stoically emerged 3rd. For the next hour, Flair carried the in-ring portion with exuberant selling, a litany of bumps, and tremendous reactions to the entrance of major babyface threats, particularly Piper at 15, whose entry resulted in a priceless grimace on Flair's mug. As this was going on, Heenan was getting a similar workout to his client, trying vainly to coach from a distance, pleading with God to let Flair win and he'll try to be a better person, and just all manner of hilariously losing his mind. There has never been a wrestler-commentator relationship quite like the one Flair shared with Heenan for that magical hour. The Jakes and Savages and Takers and Hogans and Sids all filed in as the drama built masterfully. Every ensuing elimination brought us closer to a brand new champion. The final 4 were Hogan, Flair, Savage, and Sid. Savage got dumped, but when a beat red still battling Flair tried to bring the fight to Hogan, the Hulkster fought back, sending Flair over the ropes. As Hulk tried to kick Flair off the apron, Sid crept up behind his fellow babyface and threw him out, drawing a very loud cheer. Hogan was deprived of title number 5, but he wasn't gonna let Sid win. From the floor, he snatched Sid by the arm, and in the ensuing struggle, Flair snuck up and dumped Sid over to win the Rumble. Many fans in the arena were elated at the result, but none happier than Heenan, who proceeded to do a fine impression of Meg Ryan in When Harry Met Sally over the headset. Flanked by a jubilant Heenan and Perfect in his victory speech backstage, Flair told the world that the WWF title is the only championship that makes you number 1 in pro wrestling. It was one final kick in the balls to Jim Herd, who just recently resigned from WCW after 3 tumultuous years. Speaking of tumultuous, despite the allure of having the 30-man gauntlet before the WWF title, the 1992 Rumble drew just 260,000 buys, down 41% from 1 year earlier. Though Hogan and Sid were held apart from a brawl at the end of the Rumble, it was initially declared that Hogan would challenge Flair for the WWF title at WrestleMania 8, prompting obvious anger from Sid, who felt his being the runner-up should have netted him the shot. WWF telegraphed a Sid heel turn from a mile away to a head-spinning degree. When footage of the Rumble's ending was broadcast on the weekend shows, a phony-sounding chorus of boos was dubbed in when Sid eliminated Hogan. Monsoon and Heenan even recorded a new commentary track for the footage, with Gorilla now strongly emphasizing that Sid was a cowardly thief in the night that back-jumped Hulk. The WWF was bending over backwards to paint Hogan as the hero, when in reality, he was eliminated fairly and acted like a poor sport in causing Sid's elimination. A few weeks after the Rumble, Sid fulfilled the planned heel turn on the first Fox broadcast of Saturday night's main event. In a tag match against Flair and Undertaker, Sid walked out on Hogan, still feeling hostile about the Rumble ending and the title match passover. The card for WrestleMania was amended to have Hogan give up the title shot to instead face Sid. Meanwhile, Flair would get to defend against the next man in line, Savage. Though the two had no real story connection, the WWF made up for lost time by having the ever-amorous Flair claim to have known Elizabeth years before Savage did, and he produced doctored photos of the two of them sharing wholesomely romantic moments together. Savage was not only fighting to become a 2-time champ, but to defend the honor of his wife. This left Roberts without an opponent, but he quickly gained one: The Undertaker. Savage vanquished Roberts once and for all on that same Saturday night's main event, but post-match, Jake lay in wait backstage with a chair, prepared to strike the happy couple. That's when Undertaker surprisingly intervened, apparently objecting to Roberts attempting to once more strike a woman. Behind the ghoulish facade, Undertaker apparently had some form of moral compass, and his feud with Jake came equipped with a face turn. Factor in the Piper-Brett IC title match, and WrestleMania 8 looked promising on paper, boasting the potential to look good in front of a stadium crowd at Indianapolis's Hoosier Dome. Hogan's ostensible farewell match was the front page of what appeared to be a hot ticket in better times. Of course, these weren't better times. The Legion of Doom had been tag team champions since August and remained the WWF's most popular duo. At an SWS joint show in December, the team better known as the Road Warriors even entered to their familiar Iron Man theme, a missing component to their WWF run. But in the earlier months of 1992, the team itself was going to be missing. For the second time in 8 months, Hawk failed a drug test and was going to be shelved for several months. LOD dropped their belts at a Denver house show on February 8th to a brand new team. DiBiase and IRS had come together to form Money Inc., managed by Jimmy Hart. Hart's random involvement was shown to be an act of gold digging on his part and caused a rift with his other clients, the Natural Disasters. They turned face as a result and immediately feuded with the cash grabbers. Things were worse for Kerry Von Erich. He was arrested on February 9th in a Dallas suburb on 2 counts of forging drug prescriptions. At the time of his arrest, Von Erich was dealing with a failing marriage, losing the 4th of 5 brothers months earlier, 21-year-old Chris to suicide, and had been dealing with serious substance issues for a number of years. Later that week, at a house show in St. Louis, more than half a dozen police personnel instituted a raid of WWF talents as they arrived for the card. The wrestlers had apparently been alerted earlier that evening about the impending search for illegal substances and were all able to discard anything that would have gotten them into trouble prior to arriving. And in March, a bleak forecast for the WWF grew even bleaker. About 1 month before WrestleMania, former wrestlers turned backstage staffers Pat Patterson and Terry Garvin, as well as longtime ring announcer Mel Phillips, resigned from the company amid allegations of sexual misconduct. The charges were levied by 2 former ring attendants who were underage at the time and an ex-front office employee, as well as former lower card wrestler Barry Orton, brother of Cowboy Bob and uncle of Randy. Also making accusations was Murray Hodgson, a short-lived talking head for studio updates. Hodgson claimed in a lawsuit that he lost his job due to spurning advances from Patterson. Meanwhile, Rita Chatterton, a WWF referee for a spell in the mid-80s, accused McMahon himself of improprieties. Talk shows like Larry King Live and Donahue served as battlegrounds for the parties to air their grievances, with McMahon doing all he could to verbally defend his promotion from all charges. Geraldo Rivera was eventually sued by the WWF for airing Chatterton's story on his talk show Now It Can Be Told. The Donahue broadcast felt more like a deranged group therapy session, as the stage included Vince, Hodgson, Orton, superstar Billy Graham, Bruno Sammartino, Dave Meltzer, wrestling historian and talk show host John Arezzi, and a retired wrestler named Tom Hankins, who was there partially in support of Orton. Accusers reiterated their stories, while Graham and Sammartino publicly registered disgust with the WWF being an apparent haven for unchecked sleaze. Another accuser attended the talk show taping but didn't speak. Former ring attendant Tom Cole reached a financial settlement with the WWF and, according to Sex, Lies and Headlocks, sat in the studio audience next to Linda McMahon. Part of the settlement was that he got his old job back, though the WWF later let him go in the summer of 1993. As for the talk show forum itself, one of the highlights was McMahon telling Hodgson to his face that the reason he was fired is because he was bad at his job. While Hodgson came off well-spoken and earnest in his media appearances, it was later learned that his own lawyer dropped him after coming to believe he was dishonest. McMahon attorney Jerry McDevitt found that Hodgson had an apparent history at his prior jobs of making baseless accusations toward his employers. Hodgson's lawsuit was later dismissed, with the judge reportedly calling him a habitual liar and con man. Garvin and Phillips never again worked for the WWF. Patterson returned to his position later in 1992, and as Dave Meltzer wrote in Patterson's 2020 obituary, Vince McMahon at the time told me that it was media going after people because they were gay. But when it came to the individuals, he always maintained one of the 3 was innocent. Between Hodgson's story falling apart and Graham later recanting an accusation that he made about Patterson on Donahue, barring anything unforeseen, the longtime booker was going to be brought back at the earliest opportunity. By the time Patterson reassumed duties within the WWF, so much would have changed. WrestleMania 8 was very much the last dance, minus the thrill of Michael Jordan sinking one more clutch shot. While the post-WrestleMania period is somewhat synonymous with major house cleaning, the cleanup began long before the show of shows. By early March, Greg Valentine, Jimmy Snuka, The Barbarian, Pat Tanaka, and Hercules joined the fired Neidhart and the legally hampered Jannetty outside the Federation sanctum. None of the above were main event adjacent, nor were Warlord, Chris Walker, and Colonel Mustafa, each of whom filed out in the weeks following the April 5th Mania. Some of these names were aging vets past their primes, while others had perhaps a little too much muscle at a time when the WWF needed to de-emphasize the amount of testosterone in their production. Hogan may have streamlined his once 300-pound musculature, something spun by commentators as Hogan giving up strength in favor of speed and cardio, but he was nonetheless bowing out after one more match with Sid, promoted open-endedly as what could be his farewell match. Also on the outs, though few likely realized it at the time, was Piper. Hot Rod's IC title match with Hart would be his last match for over 2 years. In fact, post-WrestleMania, Piper recorded several Piper's Pit segments for the weekend shows, none of which aired as intended. For all the noise Piper tended to make, it was almost criminal that he'd vanish from the WWF rather quietly. Hogan and Piper leaving around the same time, 7 years after co-headlining the very first WrestleMania, felt like the book was closing. And it was because of the book that Roberts wanted out. Wanting to take it easier on his ailing body, the always creative Jake the Snake made a play for the booking position vacated by the absent Patterson. McMahon apparently told Roberts that out of respect for Patterson, they weren't going to fill the position, a kayfabe answer as Vince expected Patterson back sooner or later. But Roberts didn't know that and wasn't happy with the answer he got. He instead opened negotiations with WCW and struck a deal with the young showrunner K. Allen Fry to jump ship. He intended to leave as soon as he put over Undertaker on the WrestleMania stage. Counting alternate entrants Haku and Nikolai Volkov, 12 of the 30 Royal Rumble entries from that year would be gone by the middle of May, less than 4 months after the match took place. Some of those names occupied the top matches at WrestleMania 8 in Indianapolis, along with Hogan Sid, Flair Savage, Piper Brett, and Undertaker Roberts. There was the match for the tag team titles, pitting Money Inc. against the Natural Disasters. New arrogant heel Michaels, now managed by Sherry in one of those oddball on-screen romances that somehow worked, was matched up with Santana in a promising mid-card bout. Eschewing the 14-match format of recent years, the WWF lumped a bunch of stars into one 8-man bout, as Duggan, Slaughter, Bossman, and Virgil would take on the Nasty Boys, Mountie, and Repo Man. Tatanka would face Martel, while Owen was put up against Skinner. A match between Bulldog and Berserker was scrapped the day of due to time constraints. A purported 62,000 fans filled the Indianapolis Hoosier Dome, with the total of freebies notched somewhere around 15,000. Nonetheless, the WWF managed to do double an NBA arena in paid tickets amid calamitous times. Michaels defeated El Matador in a fast-paced opener. On a day where the WWF was perhaps more driven to put smiles on people's faces, the former Rocker would be the only heel that emerged victorious. Few individuals backstage were smiling before the second bout, the one between Undertaker and Roberts. That's because, to secure his contractual release, Roberts threatened to not do the match at all unless his release was signed then and there. Backed into a corner, McMahon complied with Jake's demand. Roberts made the long walk to the ring, ate a tombstone on the floor, and became the second victim of the not yet acknowledged streak. Hart and Piper followed with a hyper-aggressive struggle between two good guys that knew all the tricks. Hart's wrestling and Piper's brawling blended nicely, and the drama spiked when Hart covertly bladed off a Piper uppercut. Blading was forbidden in the sanitized WWF of 1992, but Hart and Piper were able to skate on account of how convincing they made it look. For the finish, a bloody Hart cleverly countered Piper's sleeper hold by kicking off the turnbuckles and rolling backward into an unorthodox pinning combination to capture the title. Post-match, a mildly deflated Piper endorsed a man he often referred to as a cousin outside the ring. Perhaps it's no small coincidence that during the most tumultuous WrestleMania to date, with so many changes in the offing, the first 3 matches were won by men that would carry the promotion for the next several years. Surrounding this trio of building block wins were the debuts of 2 WCW vets. One was manager Paul Ellering, who accompanied the returning Legion of Doom during an interview segment. The other was Lex Luger, 5 weeks after losing the WCW title to Sting. Originally, Luger was going to be a star attraction for the shaky WBF before an injury and the group's closure steered him back to the squared circle. After Duggan's team won a time-filling 8-man bout, emceed by then Family Feud host Ray Combs, the WWF title bout went on 5th of 9 matches. Hogan's farewell was getting the grand finale. Savage lit into Flair with great intensity, equaling the intensity of the I Knew Her First preamble. Flair and Manager Perfect busted Savage's leg, but not before the Nature Boy very obviously bladed after an attack outside the ring. The spot resulted in Flair getting fined by an angry Vince and, as some accounts have it, very nearly fired. Whereas Hart's cutting was subtle, even a Day One fan could figure out why Flair was overtly digging at his forehead when he was sent into the guardrail. Back inside the ring, Savage limped his way to his second title, using a roll-up and a pull of the tights to defeat Flair, who, in fairness, had cheated like hell for most of the match to that point. Then, during a wild post-match scene, an irate Flair grabbed Elizabeth and kissed her, prompting her to begin smacking him before Wildman Savage flew in with clear murderous intent. Between Flair Savage and Bret Piper, this was shaping up to be a WrestleMania for the ages. Unfortunately though, the second half couldn't hold up its end, save for one well-received surprise. Tatanka defeated Martel in the veritable piss-break match, while the Disasters defeated Money Inc. via a cheap countout so the titles didn't change hands. Owen went over on Skinner in a match that barely went 1 minute, clearing the stage for the main event. Snippets of a Vince sit-down with Hogan aired, in which the retirement question was broached. Evasive and vague, Hogan kept things open-ended, not really confirming or denying. Weeks before the match, on Primetime Wrestling, Monsoon and Heenan played the Hogan-Sid match on the WWF's first ever Super Nintendo release, Super WrestleMania. Boasting 10 wrestlers, the game was already about to be 20% obsolete with the exits of Hogan and Roberts. By the end of April, it would be 30% as Sid walked out of the WWF weeks after WrestleMania, he himself refusing to take a drug test. Half the entrants in WrestleMania's 4 most promoted bouts would be non-factors by May. Not that Sid vs. Hogan was any great shakes. The match was slow, basic, and largely unappealing. The only appealing element was Hogan's entrance, as the camera tracked up the long aisleway before reaching the outgoing King as he took his first steps into the stadium. It was an accelerated tracking shot that underscored the gravity of the moment. For as beautiful as that bit of camera work was, the ending proved to be ugly. Papa Shango was supposed to run in and break up the pin attempt after a Hogan leg drop, giving Hulk a hollow DQ victory. However, Shango was dispatched way too late, so Sid had to kick out of the usually protected maneuver. The improvised disqualification involved Sid's manager Harvey Whippleman barely interfering, making for a very lame ending or possible ending to a storied career. Shango and Sid attacked Hogan post-match, setting the stage for a fairly welcome surprise: the shocking return of the Ultimate Warrior. The thudding, familiar beats of Warrior's theme blared through the dome as Warrior manically sprinted up the long aisle to a thunderous cheer. He helped Hogan dispatch the 2 towering bad guys before sharing the final stage with his main event peer. The WWF struck a new deal to bring Warrior back, to try and fill the impending Hogan-sized void. It was an understandable move and a very necessary one given how the audience was shrinking at the same rate that the remaining muscles were. The 390,000 buys for WrestleMania 8 were only slightly down from the 400,000 for the prior year's show, but that could be seen for what it was: a large audience seeing Hogan off following one last hurrah under stadium lights. The first week of June 1992 marked 10 years since Vince McMahon met with his father and the 3 other Federation stockholders to complete the sale of all company stock to Junior. Nobody in that room could have foreseen how the next 10 years would flesh out for the New York-rooted enterprise, perhaps not even the man now steering the ship. Sure, McMahon had grandiose plans for what was still a territorial wrestling group, but he could only control so much. Bullish moves had the WWF positioned as a money loser in 1984, while the first ever WrestleMania desperately needed to succeed in order to ensure the company's survival. Experiments like rock and wrestling could have been received poorly. Force-feeding his Big Apple-centric product into markets where other wrestling formulas were more time-tested wasn't guaranteed to work. In one case, it didn't. And so much of the WWF's success hinged on finding the right face for the outfit. Could somebody not named Hulk Hogan have helmed the McMahon mothership? Could they have forged the same pop culture prestige and drawn even more money than the muscle man from Venice Beach? To watch Hogan stand tall beneath a hail of pyro on that April night, and to consider the uncertain future that McMahon's empire now faced, one could easily lament how a few wrong steps drew blood from pro wrestling's most imposing giant. To look at the bigger picture, one could also appreciate just how far the WWF had come over those 10 unforgettable years. A stadium crowd of 60,000, a household name in yellow trunks, an event purchased by hundreds of thousands of American homes across 4 time zones. Who in 1982 dreams this except a third-generation promoter with some P.T. Barnum in his DNA? Vince McMahon could see the future of wrestling when his father's confidants, and the other American promoters could not. But it's doubtful even he could have properly estimated the lasting appeal of this era. Nostalgia is a hell of a drug, and generations of wrestling fans today return to the golden age seeking another hit. Video game DLC, retro print t-shirts, modern wrestling programs with an old school theme, a streaming service overflowing with every classic match and moment, and nods to the past from today's stars. We'll never forget this period of Federation history, in large part because we won't let each other forget it. And that says nothing of how much today's pro wrestling has been influenced by innovations from that time period. The way wrestling is filmed, the way television matches unfold, the way angles progress and events are promoted, the particular emphasis on showmanship. Much of it owes a little homage to giant steps taken in those neon-clad 80s. Not everything was as perfect as a Kurt Hennig gum swat, be it hacky television, a tasteless character arc, or degenerate incidents beyond the ring. But every great period bears its warts. For better or worse, the contrast does provide the dizzying highs with a little more shine. So much changed along the way. The WWF title became pro wrestling's preeminent prize, oft carried by an overly tanned superhero, defended vigorously against a cadre of giants, and occasionally ceded to either a larger-than-life villain or a hero of comparable stock. The Intercontinental title, the Workhorse Championship, brought together the sport's finest athletes for classic battles. The cage match in Baltimore, the grudge match in Pontiac, and an otherworldly title for title bout in Toronto are credits to the rich history of the IC strap. Some would call this period the golden age for tag teams, as a staggering wealth of duos in matching attire warred for the right to be the faces of tandem combat. Samoans and patrollers, bulldogs and hearts, demos and doomers, and the top-shelf twosomes that chased them in perpetuity. TV was a vital part of the mounting blitz. Regional syndication, trendy MTV, expanding USA, and the Shangri-La that was NBC became outposts for pro wrestling redefined. And TV begat pay-per-view, the evolutionary link that followed closed-circuit broadcasts. The all-important WrestleMania was born out of boldness, while its three oldest kid sisters were created at least partially out of spite. But whatever their origin, the Big Four persist to this day, each boasting awesome histories of their own. The stars came out in droves, some to spectate, others to participate. The glitz and glamour was evident in the soundtrack of the time, the Federation ably walking in lockstep with the cultural zeitgeist. All of this happened during a time that those who lived it will never forget, and those that followed it yearn to retroactively experience. The Golden Age, in accordance with the era of societal excess that it coincided with, had more than its share of everything. It grew big, it promoted big, it talked big, it lived big, and when things went south, it bittersweetly died big. The memories remain. Fans relive them, cherish them, and recall the specific moments between those red, white, and blue ropes that first caught their eye. The world was very much watching the WWF throughout its golden age, and for many, it was those golden times that hooked them for life.